It's me again. You all are probably sick of me, but we have one more Instagram Live because it's been such an important news week, and I'm going to talk to Charlie Sykes. I love talking to Charlie. He is the author of How the Right Lost Its Mind, a contributor and columnist for MSNBC. He also writes a daily Substack covering politics called To the Contrary. He is a very smart person who I'm sure has a lot to say. How are you,
Good.
Charlie?
How are you?
I'm good. It is so great to see you and to talk to you. And I'm just, as much as I was born in 1957. As much as I love my followers and they're so great and they are smart and have mostly good comments, not always. I'm going to get rid of the comments just for a second because they're covering your face. If you have some questions for Charlie, who's one of the smartest political analysts around, please just ask him in the question thing. All right. Okay, I'm just gonna fire it away, Charlie. Hi, by the way.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. All right, what did you think of the first night of the RNC?
Well, look, I think people need to understand this is not like a great deliberative body. All of this is a giant infomercial. I mean, obviously, the two major storylines are the selection of JD Vance and then Donald Trump showing up to overshadow JD Vance. And you have no question about it that Donald Trump is in complete mastery of the Republican Party. They are somewhere between delirious and ecstatic to rally around him. He's wearing the bandage. He can be the hero and the martyr at the same time. But I think that the long-term consequential event that took place last night was picking JD Vance. I mean, doubling down on MAGA. I mean, that was a clear signal of the future of the Republican Party.
Let's talk about that. Were you surprised by the choice? And talk about the epiphany that JD Vance had somewhere between 2016 and 2020.
Wow, epiphany is a very kind word. You're a very nice person. I would use some different words than epiphany
to
describe what has happened. Well, I just think the transmogrification.
Oh, well, that's such a big word. I don't know if I could even pronounce that, Charlie.
The devolution, the metamorphosis of JD Vance. I actually admit that I was surprised. I thought that Trump would go with a safer pick, somebody who would be lower profile. Look, I mean, he's haunted by the ghost of Mike Pence, right? He doesn't want somebody who has even a vestige of conscience, who might say no to him at some crucial moment. The vice president is the only person he can't fire. So it is a very, very important decision. Instead, he went with JD Vance, who brings an awful lot of, I suppose the conventional word is baggage, but he will be a target-rich environment for Democrats.
Because, well, let's just explain to our viewers, and many of them know, but he was, and I interviewed him, by the way, before the 2016 election. He was a kind of a never Trumper. He called Trump Hitler. He said all kinds of disparaging things about Donald Trump. And then what happened? He ran for Senate.
He ran for Senate. I mean, look, JD Vance is a considerable intellect. I mean, he was a best-selling author. They made a movie about
Hillbilly
Elegy. You know, and his opinion on Donald Trump was absolutely unambiguous. As you point out, he compared him to, he said he was an American Hitler. In interviews, said he believed that, in fact, he was a serial sexual predator. Well, now apparently he's okay with those sorts of things. From the moment when he became Peter Thiel's candidate for U.S. Senate, he began remaking himself, abandoning almost all of the principles and ideas that he talked about and embracing this hard version of MAGA, not just the populist nationalist part of it, but really imitating the trollish language, the insults, and it was like someone trying to completely remake themselves. And I think that there was a belief among some people that, okay, he's doing this just to get elected in Ohio. He's a really, really smart guy, and deep inside, he's decent. But then obviously he decided that if he tried to be Trump's mini-me, that maybe there was more there. And he has been engaged in this Olympics of self-abasement with other candidates to try to curry Donald Trump's favor, embracing the big lie, attacking Donald Trump's opponents, going all in Donald Trump's attack on the criminal justice system, and has remade himself into an extreme version of MAGA, in some ways, perhaps even more ideologically extreme than Trump himself.
And what kind of machinations did he have to go through? Donald Trump is someone who does hold a grudge. And I'm curious how he was able to convince former President Trump that he was just kidding, or he has had such a change of heart, and that he is a true believer now, because Mr. Trump does have a long memory, Charlie.
Boy, this is an excellent question, and because it really goes to the heart of what goes on inside of Donald Trump's mind, which I regard as a very scary place. But Donald Trump has a very long memory, but he also likes it when people grovel. He likes it when he compels people to take a knee, whether it's Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz. He likes them to self-humiliate. I don't know, I can't put it all together because I'm not a psychologist. But what he had to do was similar to what others had to do. If you're Elise Stefanik, for example, or you're Marco Rubio, or you're anybody else who's said negative, perfect examples, who have said negative things in the past about Donald Trump, you have to swing the other way and make it clear to Donald Trump that I will be joined at the hip with you. I will mimic you. I will be your ventriloquist dummy, in a sense. So when you have someone like someone like JD Vance, he shows up in New York for the criminal trial about the hush money for the porn star. He will attack anyone perceived to be an enemy of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump looks at him and says, okay, I've beaten this guy. I've beaten him down. He will do what I want.
He has very extreme views towards women, reproductive rights, and I know suburban moms or suburban women, they're a big target for the Republican Party. Do you think that his selection will alienate these suburban women who voted for Joe Biden but maybe are undecided now?
Well, that's another very interesting question, because obviously, if that was the target for Donald Trump, he would not have selected JD Vance.
Right.
JD Vance has too many comments telling women who are abused you should not get a divorce, you should stay in the abusive marriage. Very extreme views in the past on abortion. So clearly, he's convinced himself that going for kind of the white working class nationalist populist line is the way to break the blue wall. I think that the thinking would be that JD Vance will appeal to the voters who will determine not just Ohio, which is Trump is probably going to win, but Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
And he has seen a surge among men, not
yes.
only white men, but also African-American
Yes.
men and Hispanic males. And, it's interesting to me, I interviewed Tim Alberta not too long ago, who wrote that terrific piece in the Atlantic, Charlie, about this whole election is about strength versus weakness, according to the Trump campaign. And this kind of testosterone-y, vigorous, macho character. And I think what happened on Saturday, which was horrific, very much played into Donald Trump as a strong, virile person who wasn't going to let somebody, get him down. I mean, obviously, or take him down in this case, and how he defiantly, held up his wrist, and that iconic photo now with blood on his face in front of the American flag. It's pretty amazing. I was talking to Mary Trump just moments ago that he did have the wherewithal to, handle himself that way. But that really does play into this white working class support, doesn't it?
This is the weakness versus the strength versus weakness. I mean, this is something I think Bill Clinton's famous quote that, if the choice is between strong and wrong and weak and right, people are going to choose strong. And I think that that's the Trump calculation. And this unfortunately sets up the contrast with Joe Biden, which we can get to in a moment. But you're right. Look, it's not breaking news that that Donald Trump is a showman. He knows how to put on the reality TV show. But even Donald Trump could not have scripted that particular moment. So, I have been a consistent Trump critic, but I have to say, that was an iconic moment. And I agree with Jonathan Martin, who wrote in Politico that image may be the defining image of the 2024 campaign, beyond his wildest dreams. And this is just a political reality. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, in that moment, he did exactly what he had to do, and it played to his strength. And that's going to be something that we're going to live with between now and November.
Meanwhile, as you mentioned, Charlie, it's being contrasted with Joe Biden and questions about his ability to govern and his debate performance and some of his other appearances, after the debate. He is clearly in it to hopefully win it, in his view. Do you think there's any chance at this point that Joe Biden will step down, or do you think that train has left the station?
I think that train is starting to leave the station. I think it's starting to gather a little bit of speed. But, I was just reading before I came on with you, reading this New York Times account of, Adam Schiff in deep blue California, apparently telling donors, if Joe Biden stays in, we Democrats can get blown out. Nancy Pelosi has been making calls saying, this is a real problem. And I guess I have to admit to you that I'm a little disappointed in Joe Biden's approach to this and of his staff. Because first of all, I think they did create a bubble. I think they have been in denial about that. I think there's been an assumption that something else would take care of Donald Trump, that Donald Trump would fall of his own weight, or the criminal justice system would get Donald Trump. And so they figured they don't have to be more forthcoming about the obvious issues that Joe Biden faces, and they're not just old. The reason why there was such a furor after the debate was not because people looked at it and said, that's one bad night. They looked at it and said, oh my gosh, this is something that we haven't seen before, or we've seen and we tried to ignore. So my disappointment is that at this moment, if in fact you believe that Donald Trump's return to power is an existential threat to our constitutional republic, if it really is an existential threat, then you have to act like it. And people need to put country over personal ambition or personal feelings. And I guess I'm a little bit disappointed because Joe Biden has not done away with the doubts. And there's very little he can do, I think, to not look like the frail old guy who is clearly in decline against this man who I think is malignant and malicious and dangerous, but right now is going from strength to strength.
Having said that, as the Democratic Party continues to fracture and this chatter continues, if this is further weakening Joe Biden's chances of defeating Donald Trump, given there's so much disarray and a lack of unity in the Democratic Party.
Yes, it is. However, keeping silent and not seeing what we are actually seeing with our own eyes, or not acting on it, is not, I think, the approach. I know that some people think that it is the chatter that's the problem, but that's what democracy looks like. At this point, this is why we debate. And the Democratic Party is very different than the Republican Party. And I have to say, a lot of this feels very similar. As somebody who went through the whole Trumpian takeover, was at a certain point, everybody said, shut up, don't pay any attention to who and what Donald Trump is. We all have to fall into line. And I think that this is one of those moments where we need radical transparency and radical honesty about what we are facing and whether or not Joe Biden, number one, has what it takes to beat Donald Trump. Because I think that is the number one task in 2024. In 2024, our prime directive is not about Joe Biden. It is about protecting the country from Donald Trump. So number one, does he have what it takes to beat Donald Trump? Number two, does he have what it takes to serve as president for the next 4 years? Because that's a question that, frankly, swing voters are going to be asking themselves. And they have to answer that question. And if they can't answer that in the affirmative, then we need to have this debate. Is there a better path? Or are we somehow locked into this Titanic voyage headed straight into the iceberg? I mean, if the Titanic is headed toward the iceberg, the argument should not be, should we talk about it? Should we let anybody know about it? Maybe if we keep talking about that iceberg, it's bad. And if you talk about the iceberg, you really don't want to get to New York. No, you need to talk about the iceberg. And right now, the iceberg is this issue of Joe Biden.
And if not Joe Biden, who, Charlie?
Well, I may disagree with some other folks here. I don't think there's any alternative to Kamala Harris. I mean, the Democratic Party is not going to bypass an African American woman vice president. They're not going to do that. So if it is, if he does step aside, he's going to have to pass the mantle to his vice president. And by the way, I'm not saying that that's without risk, and I'm not saying that there's not a downside to that. But I am saying that I think we know the track we're on right now. And at a certain point, if you're doing something that is leading to disaster, perhaps you ought to change course.
What's the downside? And then I want to ask you what the upside is.
Well, the downside is, look, I mean, Kamala Harris is, has her weaknesses. She, wasn't a strong presidential candidate, and we saw that. I mean, and I think there's reasons to be somewhat skeptical about that. And she will have weaknesses that Joe Biden doesn't have, but the upsides are considerable in sense of like shaking things up, changing the dynamic. And by the way, I'm not advocating. I think what I'm describing is that people underestimate how dramatic it would be for Joe Biden to say, I have served, my country for all these years. I have served as president, and now it is time to pass to a new generation. This new generation would be the first female president of the United States, the first woman of color to be elected president of the United States. And I think that this would reset the campaign. And I will tell you that we were talking about the mind of Donald Trump. The one thing that he does not want at this point is to reset this campaign. The real problem for Joe Biden right now, one of the problems, besides the swing voters, is enthusiasm. There's a massive enthusiasm gap. I think that perhaps she could bring back some of the young voters, female voters, minority voters who have either abandoned the Democratic Party or who are just completely unmotivated. Because for example, if African American voters sit home in Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Detroit, Donald Trump will be the president of the United States in January of 2025. So I'm not saying nothing's a sure thing, but at this point, that's got to be a live option.
I was thinking how this lack of access that the White House has created during the Biden administration has really hurt Kamala Harris, because I was thinking if Joe Biden had been more open to doing interviews, they could have done joint interviews. People could have seen them working together. He could have supported her. I feel like this, not having press conferences, not doing any interviews, in a weird way, hurt her in terms of her exposure and her kind of reputation.
Well, I think so, especially in retrospect. And I think there will be a lot of looking back at the decisions that were made. But one of the big questions was, and I think, and look, I'm part of this anti-Trump movement, and I talk about this all the time, and we've been focusing on Donald Trump and the trials of Donald Trump. And I guess what history is going to ask is, why weren't we more focused on and who will best protect the country from Donald Trump? If it's not going to be 81-year-old Joe Biden, shouldn't we have had a much more robust discussion of who it was going to be 3 years ago, rather than be on this glide path, rather than sleepwalking into the moment that we find ourselves in?
Especially given that in 2020, with Cory Booker, Gretchen Whitmer, and Kamala Harris standing behind him, he said he wanted people to think of him as a bridge.
Right. And I think a lot of people did. And the interesting thing about that you mentioned there is the Democratic Party actually does have a very impressive bench. You look around the country, whether you have Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania or Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, or Jared Polis in Colorado, members of the Senate.
Andy
There's an entire
Bashir, you
generation.
hear Andy Bashir's name
Andy
a lot.
Bashir would
Gina
be a,
Raimondo,
both those are
Gavin
excellent.
Newsom. I mean, there are a lot
Well,
of names that come up, but
right.
now there really isn't time to introduce them to a national audience, is there?
There is, but it would have been better if we had begun introducing them 3 years ago. I mean, this is, I think Americans right now, let's just step back from the events of the weekend. I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't know, but Americans don't want this choice. They don't want two old white guys and a guy with brainworms as their only choice. I mean, think about what we are confronted with, how great and big this country is. And we basically have two 80-year-old men and a nut job as our only choices. If there was a younger alternative, a younger pass the baton, agent of change out there, that would be a galvanizing thing. And yet nobody saw that, or nobody was willing to do anything about that, more the latter than the former. And I think that in part it was because, and I will tell you that, you know, I am wrestling with whether or not we were all in our own bubble. You know, we've talked endlessly about the right-wing alternative information silos and bubble. I think it's turned out that Democrats were also kind of in an alternative reality bubble, because even a few weeks ago, and I'm raising my hand here, this is a confessional. I mean, I was writing about, you know, the cheap fakes, you know, the videos that made Joe Biden look old and everything. And the White House was assuring us that he was, you know, bounding around the West Wing like Batman, you know, doing all of these things. And this wasn't the real guy. And then he walks out and you ask yourself, what were you not telling us? Or what were we seeing with our own eyes that we decided we were going to ignore? So were we in a bubble? And if we're in a bubble about that, are we in a bubble about other things? Are that things that we need to understand clearly between now and November? Because otherwise, we are looking at Trump 2.0.
Someone from someone asked, before I ask you this, do you think that this will change Donald Trump or change the tenor of the campaign in any long-term way?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Donald Trump is not. Donald Trump is Donald Trump. He will be the same person he was. In fact, you started it off by asking me about Monday night. So what did we see on Monday night? There was all of this, we're going to tone things down. We're going to unify the nation. And then what do we see? We see Marjorie Taylor Greene on the podium. We see JD Vance selected as his vice president. And after all of these years, how naive do we have to be to think that Donald Trump, who is running this campaign based on vengeance and retribution, is suddenly going to be a kinder and gentler figure? No.
Someone asked what you think about people saying it was God's intervention to save Trump and the campaign leaning on Christian nationalist messaging.
Well, let me answer the second one. The Christian nationalist messaging is really become, you know, very, you know, central to the MAGA world, and you see that in ways that are, some of it is to be expected, and some of it is actually quite alarming. The conflation of religion and Christian nationalism with patriotism, but the idea that somehow God's hand saved him. Well, what about the guy that was the individual who was killed? There was somebody that died. There were others who were injured there. I guess I come from a tradition where we are much more modest about assuming that we know what is going on in the mind of God. And so but this has become, I mean, I think I'm glad that the questioner raised this, because MAGA has been a cult, the Republican Party has been a cult before. The cultishness is ramped up times 10 after this weekend because of this.
So after the assassination attempt, prominent MAGA supporters were quick to lay blame on Joe Biden. In fact, JD Vance wrote on X, formerly known as Twitter, quote, "Today is not some isolated incident. The central premise of the Biden campaign is that President Donald Trump is an authoritarian fascist who must be stopped at all costs. That rhetoric led directly to President Trump's attempted assassination. Meanwhile, David Frum in The Atlantic is writing about Donald Trump's use of violent rhetoric and his lack of empathy when Paul Pelosi is attacked, or Gretchen Whitmer, there's an assassination attempt. So we have two competing narratives with each side blaming the other. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, it certainly is one of the great ironies of our time that Donald Trump, who has probably done more than any other individual to inject this toxic rhetoric of violence into our political system, would now suddenly clutch his pearls and be concerned about rhetoric. Look, there is a real distinction between legitimate criticism of a politician and actual calls for violence. Speech is not violence. Also, there's no evidence that this troubled young man had any political motivations whatsoever. All of this was, and JD Vance was reckless and demagogic by tweeting that out within hours of the actual shooting. It was irresponsible rhetoric because we didn't know what it was about. But also, I think it's very dangerous to conflate vigorous free speech, which is the lifeblood of democracy, with a violent attack, which is an attack on democracy. One thing does not necessarily lead to another.
I want to ask you about Judge Aileen Cannon dismissing the classified documents case. I mean, Donald Trump has had a run of very good luck, obviously, on Saturday, but then just yesterday with the dismissal of the classified documents case, basically arguing that appointing a special counsel, Jack Smith, violated the Constitution. Quickly, what's your take?
Well, I mean, look, Aileen Cannon turns out to be exactly who we feared she was, because courts all over the country have already ruled on this argument that there is a flaw in the funding and the appointment of the special counsel. In almost every other case, because there have been many, many cases involving special counsels, and this issue was always raised, and the judges usually summarily dismiss them because it's not a valid argument. The fact that this is what she used to kill that really is an indication that whatever you thought about her being in the tank, it probably understated it. Now, to the extent that there's any good news at all, and I'm not trying to grasp for the good news here, but to the extent that there's any good news, this is an issue that Jack Smith can now appeal to the 11th Circuit. And the 11th Circuit has not hesitated to slap Aileen Cannon down hard in the past.
But what's the time frame, Charlie?
I don't know. No one knows. I think the one thing that we do know is that Donald Trump is not going to be held accountable by the criminal justice system before the election. No one's coming to save us. And I think this has been apparent for some time. And I think this is something else that we're going to look back on and say, why were all of the guardrails that we had counted on, all the checks and balances, the rule of law, why did it fail so egregiously in holding Donald Trump account? Because Donald Trump is going to go back into power if he wins this election with a Supreme Court that has granted him vast immunity and a court system that has made it clear that they're not able to handle them. I mean, we live in a world right now where the president is in fact above the law, and Donald Trump thinks he's above the law. And this is important because one of the points of the criminal justice system is, and the criminal law is to be a deterrent, right? Is to deter people thinking, if I do this bad act, these will be the consequences. Donald Trump sitting in the Oval Office again will not be deterred. He will think that there's no chance I will be impeached by Congress, and the fact is that there's really nothing to fear from the criminal justice system. This is a uniquely dangerous alignment of the planets. In
fact, he will feel emboldened. In closing, I just want to ask you, Charlie, everyone's talking about, states that seemed safely blue, or at least leaning blue, like Minnesota and Virginia and New Hampshire, suddenly becoming up for grabs, if you will. When you are a political guru, when you look at the electoral map, do you think that, and acknowledging a lot can change between now and election day, Do you think we're headed toward a Donald Trump landslide?
Well, I don't want people to despair, because despair is not a good strategy. But I think that this is where you become sober, and this is where you do not look away from the reality here. And we could be looking at a 1980 style election. I mean, I lived through the 1980 election. I remember it very well, as you do as well, I'm sure. And it is certainly possible that
I
could
wasn't
happen.
born then, Charlie. I'm
Well,
just kidding.
I see. I was actually a senior citizen back then too. So, but I think that people ought to be concerned, and this is where, folks, going back to your discussion about Joe Biden, and what you're hearing among Democrats. This is not coming from never Trumpers or people in the media. This is coming from Democrats who are very, very concerned about this scenario. So, is it possible? Yeah, it is. And I think that people ought not to. I am concerned that one of the worst dangers the Democrats face right now is that they are consuming too much hopium, that they are closing their ears to some of the warnings, and they are injecting some irrational optimism straight into the veins. And because every time you post something about all of the swing state polls, what do you get on social media? I know you say this, you see the same things like, oh, we don't believe the polls are nothing, the polls are nothing. The reality is that in most of the recent election, the polls have been generally pretty accurate. And I think we pretty much know where they're going. And I will tell you that the private polls from both parties are telling you the same thing. Could I just mention one other thing, though, before we wrap up here?
Yeah.
Keep it too long. So I'm here in Milwaukee. I'm actually about 20 miles north of Milwaukee. So I'm not at the convention, but there are jets flying over my house, which is protecting the airspace over Milwaukee. And, I appreciate their service. I am a big fan. My dog, Eli, who is right behind me, and you hear him scratching, is not a fan. He thinks the jets are thunder, and he's very upset. And he weighs 140 pounds. And as soon as we are done with this live stream, he will crawl into my lap.
Oh, you could have had him in your lap during our conversation.
That would have made it difficult to talk.
I guess if he's 140 pounds, what kind of dog is he?
He's 140 pounds. So this is the price you pay for being a convention town in 2024.
And what kind of dog is he, Charlie?
German Shepherd.
Well, tell him we're very sorry for the planes, and that your lap is free and open for business. Charlie, thank you so much. You're so smart, and I always really love talking to you. So thank you for making the time.
All right, thank you so much. It's been great.
Okay, talk to you soon. Bye.